Short brothers had high hopes for their experimental S-5 Singapore Mark I. This aircraft first took to the skies on January 5, 1925. It performed flawlessly during a marathon flight around Africa, covering 23,000 miles. The man behind that trip was Sir Alan Cobham, one of the great long-distance pioneers of the age. It was a survey flight all the way around the African continent, down to the Cape and back again, and it put the Singapore name on the front pages. Despite this success, a production order never followed. The next version, the S-12 Singapore Mark II, first flew in 1930. It was slightly more successful. But it was the S-19 Singapore Mark III that truly stood out. The company finally secured a contract for 4 prototypes to iron out the final design. The first of these updated flying boats made its first flight on June 25, 1934. Trials went so well that the Air Ministry ordered another 33 production aircraft, bringing the total to 37. The Singapore III entered Royal Air Force service in April 1935. Number 23, O Squadron was the first unit to receive the type. By that late spring, the aircraft were arriving at frontline squadrons back home in Britain. That fall, they were deployed to Basra, Iraq. In October 1936, several of them were permanently based in Singapore. Getting these boats out to their far-flung stations was not a simple matter, and it could go badly wrong. In January 1935, 4 Singapores set out from Pembroke Dock in Wales, bound for number 2 O5 Squadron in the Far East. The flight was plagued from the start by engine trouble and by illness among the crews, and it fell weeks behind schedule. Then, on February 15th, in poor visibility, one of them flew into the Peloritani Mountains near Messina in Sicily. Everyone on board was killed. 8 Royal Air Force men and a civilian technical officer from the Royal Aircraft Establishment. They were buried in the Naval Cemetery on Malta. 4 would eventually end up on the far side of the world in New Zealand hands, but we will come back to that. They operated over an enormous stretch of the globe. During the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, present-day Ethiopia, in the fall of 1935, they flew out of Aden to patrol the Red Sea and parts of the Indian Ocean. By late 1937, they were based in Malta. From there, they escorted British merchant ships off the coast of Spain, torn apart by civil war. Their base was RAF Califrana, right on the southern tip of Malta, and the job carried a name that sounded like something out of a much older century. It was called Anti-Piracy Patrol. Unidentified submarines had been attacking merchant shipping in the western Mediterranean, and Singapores were pushed further west, onto Algeria, as part of an international effort to stop the gun running and protect neutral ships. Yet despite this active service, production ended in June 1937. The short Singapore III looked much like other Royal Air Force flying boats of the day. But it was a genuinely impressive thing to stand next to. The wings spanned 90 feet, and slung between them in 2 streamlined nacelles sat 4 Rolls Royce Kestrel engines arranged as tandem push-pull pairs. In each nacelle, one propeller pulled and the other one pushed. Behind the wings, 3 tail fins stood up in a row. And that triple tail is what makes a Singapore instantly recognizable in a photograph, even at a distance. The hull was all metal, built of duralumin, while the wings were metal-framed and covered in fabric. Short brothers had a reputation for building boat hulls that could absorb punishment, and the Singapore lived up to it. On the water, it was steady, seaworthy, and surprisingly easy to handle. The Mark III also gave its pilots something the earlier boats never had, a properly glazed cockpit. For the first time, the men flying one of these were not sitting out in the open weather. A normal crew was 6. To defend themselves, they had 3 Lewis guns in .303 caliber, 1 in the nose, 1 amidships, and 1 right back in the tail. All 3 were open positions, exposed to the wind, the rain, and the sea spray. Under the wings, the boat could carry up to 1,100 pounds of bombs or depth charges. On paper, the performance was modest, even in 1935. Flat out at 5,000 feet, a Singapore III would manage about 136 miles an hour. Cruising economically, it settled at just over 100. Range was around 1,000 miles, and the service ceiling was roughly 15,000 feet, though a maritime patrol crew almost never went anywhere near that. Their working height was 1,000 feet or so above the waves, where they could actually see something. Because the main sensor on board was the Mark I eyeball. The tanks held close to 800 imperial gallons, and for the longest sorties, an extra fuel tank could be strapped onto the top of the hull. Empty, the boat weighed over 20,000 pounds, loaded up for a patrol, closer to 28,000. During their relatively short service life, these Singapores flew from home waters in Britain to the most remote corners of the British Empire. But aviation technology was advancing rapidly. By the outbreak of World War II, the Singapore 3 was considered hopelessly obsolete. They were rapidly being replaced by more modern types. The aircraft taking their place came from the same factory. It was the short Sunderland, a big monoplane with an enclosed hull, and next to it, the old biplane looked like it belonged to another century. By the time war broke out in Europe, that changeover was already well underway. 19 Singapores were still on charge, and most of them were quietly pushed into second-line work, training new flying boat crews at units like No. 4 Coastal Operational Training Unit. No. 2. 05 Squadron was the last unit to actively fly them, keeping them on strength until April 1941. Fittingly, the squadron was based in the aircraft's namesake, Singapore itself. There is one other job the type is remembered for, and it had nothing to do with the military at all. In May 1936, Qantas borrowed a Singapore from the Royal Air Force to survey the air route between Singapore and Sydney for the airline services that were being planned all the way through to Europe. Hudson Fysh, one of the founders of Qantas, was on board. The boat worked its way down through the islands to Darwin, put down on the Roper River in the Northern Territory, and carried on around the Australian coast to Brisbane and Sydney. That survey helped choose the staging bases that Empire flying boat services would use for years afterwards. As the Japanese Empire's expansionist goals in Asia and the Pacific became obvious, they set off alarm bells in Wellington. Understanding the threat, the New Zealand Military Command appealed to London with an urgent request. They desperately needed maritime patrol aircraft to fly reconnaissance and keep watch over the South Pacific. But the RAF was dealing with its own severe aircraft shortages at the time. All they could offer their New Zealand allies were a few obsolete Singapore flying boats. These aircraft had just been retired from No. 2 05 Squadron. By early 1941, they were no longer in active service. With no other options, the New Zealanders accepted. 4 of these aircraft joined the Royal New Zealand Air Force. From the start, the plan was to deploy these Singapores to Fiji, but there was a major logistical hurdle. They still had to ferry the big flying boats all the way out there. To tackle the job, 4 pilots headed to RAF Seletar in Singapore. The team included 2 experienced flying boat captains, Edward Lewis and David Baird, along with pilots Richard Hickson and James Winfield. 4 more airmen were sent out to join them. In mid-September 1941, this small group officially formed a special ferry flight. Right after arriving at the base, the New Zealanders threw themselves into converting onto their new, if decidedly elderly, aircraft. Before long, they were airborne in the first 2 Singapores handed over to them by the British. By late September, the rest of the unit had arrived. On October 1st, Baird officially took charge of the group. Their training took place under the watchful eye of British veterans who had flown these boats before and knew all their quirks. Finally, on October 14th, 4 Singapore flying boats were officially handed over to the New Zealand pilots. Just 2 days later, Winfield took the controls of his aircraft. He became the first to set off on the long flight to their distant posting. Lewis lifted off right behind him. It was an odyssey. The flight proved to be grueling, requiring countless stops for refueling and rest. The route passed through some of the remotest corners of the globe. It took them over Batavia, today's Jakarta, and Surabaya on the island of Java, and across the Dutch East Indies islands of Sumbawa and Timor. From there, the crews headed to Port Darwin in Australia and then on to New Guinea. The second leg of the long journey took the pilots over the Solomon Islands, the Santa Cruz Islands, and the New Hebrides. They finally reached Fiji, setting down in the harbor at the capital, Suva. Despite the sheer distance and the advanced age of the aircraft, this epic journey went off without a hitch. On November 14th, Winfield was the first to reach their final destination. 4 days later, Lewis arrived at the base as well, and with that, a new squadron was born. No. 5 Squadron was officially formed on November 18, 1941. Lewis was placed in command. The other crews were led by Hickson and Winfield, along with British liaison officer William Craig. Alongside the pilots, the unit's strength included 24 ground crew under engineering officer Thomas Hull. To prepare for the growing threat, the newly arrived aircraft were immediately fitted with defensive armament and upgraded navigation gear. Their peacetime markings gave way to wartime identification codes. There was one oddity that followed these 4 aircraft right to the end. They never received New Zealand serial numbers. They kept the Royal Air Force serials they had been built with: K6912, K6916, K6917, and K6918, and simply wore their new squadron code letters, OT, alongside them. The unit was declared fully operational on the very eve of the war that was about to sweep across the Pacific. By late 1941, the situation in Southeast Asia was going bad fast. In response to this growing threat, Far East Command decided to pool its forces. They attached the remaining half of the New Zealand detachment to No. 205 Squadron. Commanded by Baird, this group of pilots never got the chance to leave for Fiji. Events moved too fast. On December 8th, local time, Japanese forces launched their invasion of Malaya, hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Throughout that tense day, New Zealand crews flew continuous combat patrols. On December 10th, they flew a series of vital reconnaissance missions for the ill-fated British force Zed. This naval task force was centered on the battlecruiser HMS Repulse and the battleship HMS Prince of Wales. Shortly afterward, Japanese torpedo bombers attacked and sank both ships. Following this tragedy, the Singapore crews were pulled from combat duties until they were relocated to Fiji on December 13th. Meanwhile, aircraft already based in Fiji had begun combat operations on December 15th. Squadron leader Lewis flew a patrol to scout the best locations for early warning radar stations. Just 2 days later, however, the unit suffered its first major accident. On takeoff from the water at the Suva flying boat base, the aircraft's elevator trim tab suddenly jammed. This forced Lewis to abruptly abort the takeoff run. But stopping a heavy, speeding aircraft on the water is practically impossible. After all, flying boats don't have brakes. As a result, the aircraft slammed into a sandbar at the far end of Suva Bay at high speed. The impact was so severe that the squadron's ground crew couldn't repair the damage. The aircraft eventually had to be written off and scrapped. It was K6916, barely 5 years out of the short works at Rochester. Fortunately, none of the crew were injured. Despite the loss, No. 5 Squadron kept growing as more men arrived. By December 19th, the squadron was 90 men strong. Just before Christmas, the British handed over their last 2 Singapore flying boats. With more men arriving in late December, the squadron finally had just about everything it needed, men and machines, to go to war. The missions assigned to No. 5 Squadron were fairly standard for the time. They mostly consisted of flying air cover for Allied shipping convoys, searching for enemy submarines, and hunting Japanese surface raiders. Occasionally, the aircraft also flew as transports, hauling vital cargo between the numerous atolls and islands of the region. The first actual combat mission out of Fiji took place on January 6, 1942. A crew commanded by Flight Lieutenant McGregor took off to hunt for enemy subs. From then on, these patrols became a grueling daily routine. Life inside the hull was not quite like anything else in the Air Force. The Singapore was built like a small ship, and it was fitted out like one. Behind a bulkhead, there was a wardroom for the officers and a separate mess for the airmen. A typical crew of 6 broke down into 2 pilots, 2 engine fitters, a rigger, and a wireless operator. And on a long patrol, there was room to move around, to brew something hot, and to sit down properly. On more than one occasion, Fijian ground crew came along for the ride, and one of them became quietly famous in the squadron for baking scones in the galley while the boat droned along a few hundred feet above the Pacific. In mid-January, Craig was appointed squadron commander. By the end of the month, regular patrols began, covering the most vulnerable approaches to the Fiji archipelago. Initially, the pilots patrolled the endless ocean and found nothing. Headquarters, though, was convinced that Japanese invasion forces were about to land on their shores at any moment. Commanders were swapped out one after another, a measure of just how nervous headquarters had become. It was hardly the aircrew's fault that the Japanese never appeared. Craig was relieved of command in February. Flight Lieutenant Hickson then took his place. After that, in early April, Robert McGill took command. That summer, on June 24, 1942, the squadron was reorganized. Number 4. Squadron of the Royal New Zealand Air Force was disbanded. All the Vickers, Vincent biplanes previously assigned to it were transferred to Number 5 Squadron. From that date, the unit carried a new name, Number 5 Army Cooperation Squadron. 4 of these aircraft were based at Nandi. Another 5 were moved to Nausori. In addition to their Army cooperation role, the Vincents were tasked with a critical new mission. They were now providing air cover for the air bases themselves. The squadron's main headquarters was also relocated to Nausori, putting it as close as possible to wherever any fighting was likely to start. On July 10th, a crew commanded by Flight Lieutenant McGregor took off on a routine patrol. Their objective was to escort the American transport ship Thomas Jefferson. The ship was steaming toward the port of Suva with high-priority cargo. Shortly after takeoff, McGregor spotted an unexpected target. Right inside the harbor, a Japanese submarine was running on the surface. The crew swung around and lined up for an attack run, but the submarine's crew had seen them and crash dived. McGregor managed to drop a 500-pound bomb just in time. It detonated right alongside the sub as it slipped beneath the surface. When the towering plume of water from the blast finally settled, the New Zealand airmen were thrilled. They saw the submarine going down bow first, which they took as a sure sign of critical damage. A Vickers Vincent was sent out from the base to press the attack, but by the time it arrived on station, it was all over. The crew were credited with a sinking, and for a long time that is how the story was told on Fiji. But the claim was never officially ratified. No Japanese submarine loss has ever been matched to that morning off Suva, and the attack is listed today as a probable at best. What did not make the headlines was the quieter work. Alongside the endless patrols, the squadron's flying boats carried out a number of air-sea rescues, pulling men out of the water in a part of the world where there was nobody else to come looking. Following these dramatic events, the standard patrol routine resumed, but the squadron had already been shaken by another loss that summer. On June 25th, a Lockheed Hudson from the recently disbanded Number 4 Squadron took off from Fiji, heading for Tonga. And it simply vanished. Along with the crew, it was carrying high-ranking passengers. This included Major General Owen Meade, Commanding General of the combined Fiji and Tonga Defense Forces. Every available Allied aircraft and ship was immediately thrown into the search. The search dragged on, but they couldn't find a single trace of the missing aircraft. Hope eventually faded, and the search was called off. Everyone aboard the Hudson was officially declared missing in action. Right around this time, the Japanese offensive in the South Pacific gained enough momentum to pose a direct threat to Fiji itself. Because of this threat, air patrols were flown practically around the clock. This pushed the crews to the point of exhaustion. The small Allied air presence in the region needed to be bolstered. To do this, consolidated PBY Catalina flying boats from U.S. Navy Patrol Squadron 11 were deployed to the islands. A new seaplane base was established for them at Saweni Bay. This was located on the west coast of Viti Levu, right between Nandi and Lautoka. With no more direct combat encounters, the crews went back to the grind of long, empty ocean patrols. In August, Number 5 Squadron went through another change in command. Flight Lieutenant Ian Salmon took over as the new commanding officer. His arrival was at least a change of pace. But with every sortie, the squadron faced a far more serious problem. The airframes and engines were wearing out alarmingly fast, and vital spare parts were simply nowhere to be found. On September 13th, the entire unit relocated to a new flying boat base at Lauthala Bay. On the map, it was an ideal location, but the move did nothing to fix their supply crisis. The parts shortage got so bad that one of the short Singapores had to be permanently grounded. It was then cannibalized for spares. Only drastic measures like this kept the other two airworthy and flying missions. On November 27, 1942, the tireless McGregor and his crew took one of them out for its final patrol. Meanwhile, all the surviving Vickers Vincents were gathered at the Nausori base. Command of Number 5 Squadron passed to Flight Lieutenant George Mackenzie. The pressure from headquarters was not letting up, and the crews of these 5 near-antique machines were hit hard by the shortage of parts and equipment. Eventually, just getting the aging Vincents airborne became downright dangerous. As a result, the squadron managed to fly only 7 combat sorties throughout the entire month of December. The ground crews spent the rest of their time trying in vain just to keep a single aircraft airworthy. There was little point in holding on to a unit that could barely get airborne. The decision was handed down, and it was carried out on January 22, 1943. Meanwhile, the Allied governments couldn't reach an agreement on transferring PBY Catalinas to the Royal New Zealand Air Force under Lend-Lease. They argued back and forth. They couldn't pin down any concrete delivery dates for the desperately needed aircraft. While the debates and the administrative red tape dragged on in London and Washington, Air Command out in Fiji suddenly realized a grim fact. They had no reconnaissance capability left at all. They had to act fast, so they scrambled to fix it themselves with whatever they still had on hand. To everyone's surprise, the last two short Singapores got airborne again. They had been sitting idle since November and were effectively written off as junk. By late February 1943, these two obsolete aircraft were formed into their own unit. They were given the rather grand title of the Singapore Flying Boat Flight. Of course, this was strictly a stopgap measure to hold the line until new aircraft arrived. Nobody doubted that Flight Lieutenant McGregor would be the one to lead this makeshift armada. By now, nothing the New Zealanders did on Fiji seemed to happen without him. Maritime patrols started almost immediately. Between March 2nd and April 16, 1943, the crews somehow managed to fly 22 patrol sorties. Remarkably, in those 6 grueling weeks, there wasn't a single accident caused by equipment failure. But time was catching up with them. Metal fatigue and the endless technical problems that came with it kept getting worse. Eventually, every flight in these Singapores became a gamble, and the stakes were simply too high for the crews. All the desperate efforts by the ground crews to keep these aircraft combat ready came to nothing. In the end, the last survivors of Fiji's patrol force were finally grounded, simply because they were worn out to the very last rivet. From then on, the crews had nothing to do. Japanese forces never did land on Fiji, and there was nothing left to fly. The brand new Catalinas that headquarters had promised weren't slated to arrive until the end of May at the earliest. Getting rid of the old boats turned out to be harder than anyone expected. Short Brothers had built those hulls to survive years of heavy landings in open water, and they were not about to fall apart on command. The ground crews went at 2 of them with axes. When that got nowhere, somebody brought in a bulldozer. That did not finish the job either. In the end, the hulls were filled with concrete and rubbish, towed out into Lautala Bay, and the bottoms were blown out of them. One went to the bottom in 300 feet of water. A 3rd boat escaped all of that. It was stripped of everything useful and sold off locally, and somebody in Fiji turned it into a houseboat. But the final irony of this story came right at the end. Just a week after the last Singapores were officially retired and sent to the scrapyard, a large transport ship set sail with a hold packed full of brand new spare parts, specifically for those obsolete flying boats.